Book of Joshua, we'll consider a little bit of the background of how we got to the book of Joshua. And I'm preaching this today because this story and this message shows God's mercy and His love to me in a profound way. And it gives me a lot of encouragement, and I hope it does to you as well. To understand the book of Joshua, you cannot understand the book of Joshua in isolation. You can only understand the book of Joshua as part of the larger story, because the book of Joshua is a fulfillment of the things that were promised by faith to Abraham and to his descendants. And in the book of Joshua is the time when they received those promises, when they realized those promises, and when they saw those promises fulfilled. So we can only understand these events if we understand the promises. Consider first Genesis chapter 15. One of these times that God came and repeated the promise to Abraham, and it seemed that every time that He repeated His promises to Abraham, God added more detail. And so here we are in Genesis chapter 15, where God meets with Abraham again. And He tells him everything that He's giving to him, a great multitude of descendants that can't even be counted, and also this territory that they would occupy. And it says in verse 16 of Genesis 15, that in the fourth generation, they, that is His children, shall return here. For the iniquity of the Amorites is not yet complete. So the promise would not be fulfilled in Abraham's lifetime, nor his sons, nor his grandsons. In fact, they would be taken as captives to Egypt. And they would be slaves there for over 400 years. And so the timing of the story of Joshua is absolutely critical to understand why the things in Joshua is happening. But this verse tells maybe the key aspect of the timing of the book of Joshua. It's not going to happen yet, and it won't happen until the fourth generation. Why? Because the iniquity of the Amorites is not yet what? It's not yet full, it's not yet complete. And so this was not just a gift to Israel, to Abraham's descendants. This was a judgment on the people of Canaan. A very unique judgment, because we have other stories of God's judgment in the Bible, such as the flood, such as Sodom and Gomorrah, where there was direct intervention, direct acts of God that brought an end to iniquity, and there was judgment, there was destruction of sinners. But in this story, his judgments are coming through His people in this time of war. And so that adds a difficult dimension to understanding God's judgments as it's coming through people in this time of war. But God was measuring the iniquity, and God would not allow the Canaanites to continue sinking deeper into sin and corruption forever and ever. The Canaanites finally reached a point where God determined that He could not permit them to go any further. And these were child sacrifices. This was deep sexual immorality. This was all intertwined in cultic idol worship. And it was very dark things. I could read some passages that describe it a little bit. But throughout the books of Moses, it's repeated sometimes later in the book of Psalms, that the nation of Israel is to be distinct and not to be polluted with the abominations that were practiced by the Canaanites. And so, perhaps before we leave the book of Genesis, we could go to Genesis 18, There's a story of God's judgment there. When God sends judgment, does God just indiscriminately destroy a mass of people? Does he allow innocent people to die among the guilty? What do you think? Abraham was very concerned about this. When God announced to Abraham about Sodom and Gomorrah, Abraham was extremely concerned that there would be innocent people that would die along with the guilty in Sodom and Gomorrah. Really, God? Please, don't tell me the whole city. If there were 50 righteous ones that are innocent, would you save the whole city for that? God said, yes, I would. Well, what about 45? Well, I would save Sodom and Gomorrah for 45 as well. And his faith, his boldness, his courage, Abraham's negotiating with God. Down, 30, 20, 10, yes, I will save just for this many. So God cares very much that the innocent are not just carelessly destroyed along with the guilty. But God is waiting until a certain point is reached among the Amorites, which later on in the Bible, the word Amorite is used in different ways. Sometimes it's used to describe a specific one of the 7 nations, and sometimes it's used like the word Canaanite to describe all of the nations in that area. And you can see that if you search the word and look at how it's used in different places. But God, with all of the Canaanites, God was waiting until a certain point is reached when he could not allow it to go any further. In other words, the Canaanites were under God's mercy for 400 years before the story of Joshua comes along. Mercy precedes judgment. But even as judgment comes along, there is mercy that is still available. And God is still looking for an opening. Even as the judgment begins, he's still looking for an opening for anybody that he might be able to show his mercy to. So can you think of anybody in the book of Joshua among the Canaanites that God spared? Rahab, first city that we come to, Jericho. And so God's judgment is surgical. And he reaches in and he looks for any excuse or reason to pull Rahab out and her whole family because she shelters the spies, and she gives a speech to the spies that we've heard of your God and what your God did to Egypt and the Red Sea and Sihon and Og and the kings across the river. We heard about all that. And so she acknowledged the superiority of Israel's God, and her faith was accepted, and Rahab was incorporated and adopted into the community of faith. Even though she was under the ban, under the 7 nations which were to be utterly destroyed. In fact, we should look at those verses as well before we go to Joshua, just so we have a little bit of background. Deuteronomy chapter 7. Deuteronomy 7. We will read a number of verses this morning. I hope that's okay with you. And in Deuteronomy chapter 7, there's 7 nations which are mentioned, which must be utterly destroyed. And you'll see here that God categorized the heathen nations into different categories, because those that were part of the 7 nations were to receive no mercy at all. And then those that were farther out, they could make treaties, they could approach them with peace, and if their offer was accepted, they could be spared and they could be saved. But there was to be no treaty, no saving of these 7 nations that are named here in Deuteronomy 7 and verse 1 and 2. When the Lord your God brings you into the land which you go to possess, and has cast out many nations before you, the Hittites, the Girgashites, the Amorites, the Canaanites, Perizzites, and the Hivites, and the Jebusites, 7 nations greater and mightier than you. When the Lord your God delivers them over to you, you shall conquer them and utterly destroy them. You shall make no covenant with them, nor show mercy to them. So these are the 7 nations which are to receive no mercy, make no covenant, and they are to be entirely destroyed, the people of these nations, without exception. Now, I didn't put the verse in my notes, but what is it? Deuteronomy 9, there's a verse in there. You know, God tells them, just so you know, I'm not giving you this land because of your righteousness, but because of their wickedness. And so, really, even more than this being a gift to Israel, it was a judgment against Canaan. But there's another category of heathen mentioned in Deuteronomy chapter 20 and verse 10, where there are certain cities that they can make peace with, that are more out on the periphery and not among these 7 nations. In Deuteronomy 20 and verse 10, when you go near a city to fight against it, then proclaim an offer of peace to it. And it shall be that if they accept your offer of peace and open to you, then all the people who are found in it shall be placed under tribute to you and serve you. And so there was provision made so that they could be saved and not be destroyed if they were open to it. So the particular story I want to look at in the book of Joshua is Joshua chapter 9, the Gibeonites, and this treaty that is secured through falsehood, through trickery, through lying, and these people are looking for mercy to Israel. And there's a few difficult things about this passage and some questions that come up, and let us consider some of these this morning. They have crossed the Jordan River. They've conquered, Jericho fell. The walls of Jericho fell. The city was burned. All were destroyed, but Rahab and her family were saved. They've gone to Ai. Ai is bigger than Jericho, and they have been conquered as well. And now they've been in Shechem, but they're going up into the hills, and they're ready to go farther in for their conquest. And so there's a lot of terrain difference, because when you're along, Jericho wasn't so many miles from the Jordan River, and the Jordan River is very lowland. And as you go westward towards the Mediterranean Sea, you go way up into the hill country. So you're going up in elevation a lot. And that was the land that they were to claim and to receive as their inheritance. Now these Gibeonites, they come with another plan. Joshua chapter 9 and verse 3. When the inhabitants of Gibeon heard that what Joshua had done to Jericho and Ai, they worked craftily and went and pretended to be ambassadors. Okay, so this is crafty, and they're going to do this whole pretending. And so they gather up their props, their worn out sandals, clothes, sacks, wineskins that are breaking, falling apart, and moldy bread. And all of these props are for one purpose and one purpose only. It's to convince them that they come from a very far country. And so it says in verse 6, and they went to Joshua to the camp at Gilgal and said to him, to the men of Israel, we have come from a far country. Now therefore make a covenant with us. Now, according to the verses that we read in Deuteronomy 7, were they supposed to make any covenants with the people nearby? No covenants. So the leaders, they have red flags going off in their mind. Verse 7, the men of Israel said to the Hivites, so now we know that the Gibeonites are Hivites. Are the Hivites one of the 7 nations? They're one of the 7 nations. So these people are to be absolutely destroyed and to receive no mercy and not to have any covenants with these people. Then the men of Israel said to the Hivites, perhaps you dwell among us, you think? So how can we make a covenant with you? Are the leaders concerned? Have they thought about the possibility that they might be getting deceived right now? They've thought of the possibility, and they are concerned. It might be advisable, just might be advisable in this scenario to pause and think about their choices very carefully. But they said to Joshua, we are your servants. And Joshua said to them, who are you and where do you come from? As if he's going to be able to believe their answer. So they said to him, from a very far country, your servants have come. And now they give this speech, which is somewhat reminiscent of Rahab's speech some chapters before, when they speak of the fame of Israel and Israel's God. Because the name of the Lord your God, we have come, for we have heard of his fame and all that he did in Egypt, and all that he did to the two kings of the Amorites who were beyond the Jordan, Sihon, king of Heshbon, Og, king of Bashan, who is at Ashtoreth. Therefore our elders spoke to us, saying, take provisions with you for the journey, and go to meet them, and say to them, we are your servants. Now therefore make a covenant with us. And then they bring out their props again, and really do their best to sell this. They've acknowledged Israel's God, the superiority of Israel's God, and they're pleading for a covenant based on a lie. They're coming with deception. Well, in verse 14, the narrator tells us what's at the bottom of what's about ready to go wrong. At the bottom of all this, verse 14, then the men of Israel took some of their provisions, but they did not ask counsel of the Lord. So Joshua made peace with them. What was the mistake they made? Yeah, they did not ask counsel of the Lord. It was a repeated mistake. Joshua's already made this mistake before. He had made this mistake with Ai. And here we are again. And a little bit of a rush, it appears. In the moment, some pressure, and just going to make a decision and live with it. And so they make peace. He makes peace with these ambassadors from this supposedly very far country. Now, this is when things get really rough for Joshua. Within 3 days, the fraud is discovered, and they find out that these people were very near and right in the heart of the territory that they were coming for, and among the 7 nations that were to make no treaties with. And now there's a great dilemma about this covenant they've made that was based on a lie, whether that covenant should be kept, and how they're going to proceed with what just happened. And it turns a bit disastrous for Joshua, because in verse 18, all the children of Israel are now having to live with the decision that's been made by their leader. The children of Israel did not attack them because the rulers of the congregation had sworn to them by the Lord God of Israel, and all the congregation complained against the rulers. Joshua's approval ratings cratered. It was an embarrassing mistake that the whole nation knew about. And now Joshua is in a crisis of credibility as a leader. The only bright spot of this story is there was no social media at the time. Because if there was, then the complaining would go very, very far. But in their complaining against Joshua, was it a legitimate complaint? Had Joshua made a mistake? Yes. So that there are different kinds of complaining. We've got a lot of complaining in the books of Moses when there was no legitimacy to the complaint, because they were complaining simply because Moses was being faithful. Now there's some legitimacy to the complaint because Joshua made a real boo-boo. He had messed up. And they were all now dealing with the consequences. The good part is that today, God's leaders in His church are perfect. We never make mistakes today. That's the great part about this whole thing, isn't it? You think so? This is one reason this story challenges me. You know, the Bible is a very special book because Joshua goes on to become a national hero for the nation of Israel. And I'm sure that if his generation, if Joshua decided to forget this story and leave it out of the record, they'd have been very happy with that. Because this was an embarrassing blunder that had just happened. Sometimes my son likes to see blooper reels. Have you ever seen a blooper reel? Or I mean, you could call them a fail video. Anybody ever seen a fail video before? They're really funny. You can see the sports people, you can see newscasters say the dumbest things on camera accidentally, or make the worst mistake and have the worst crash. And you know, if you're an entertainer, you let it go up and it's something to laugh at. But if you're a leader who takes yourself a little more seriously, it's not quite as funny. That's why leaders in this world hire professionals for public relations. So that whenever anything happens, they can tell their story, their narrative, to make them look the very best possible in the very best light. And so the successes of world leaders are exaggerated by the people that represent them, and their blunders are covered up. That's what happens in our world today, and that's what's happened throughout history. If you go to the Museum of the Bible in Washington, D.C., you can see there some of the replicas. Well, the originals are in the British Museum in London, and you can see some of these stones from Canaan, from the kings of Canaan, the Canaanites, and some of them that came later, Assyria, and these nations that were in that territory. And you could include Egypt as well. And when you see these stones, and some of them have writing and some of them have pictures, and they're boasting of their successes, of their victories, of the people that they've conquered, and the people that they've taken. And those leaders made a lot of mistakes too, but they didn't write about that part. The Bible is a very unique book in preserving unflattering details about its most iconic leaders. The Bible is particularly honest about the mistakes of the people that we look up to most in the Bible. If the Bible was nothing more than a human history of the nation of Israel, then it would certainly have been in their best national interest to scrub some of these stories from the record. However, because the Bible is an inspired document with the broader purpose of teaching God's people down to us today, the stories of both the good and the bad are carefully preserved to instruct and to warn God's people. And so even the best people in the Bible, we get to read about their blunders. So this story bothered me as a child a little bit. Partially, one of the things that used to bother me is, why would God require his people to keep a promise that was based on a fraud? If I make a contract with somebody and the other side is told a complete lie, then the contract is null and void, in my mind. But when I have reread this story, not from the perspective of the Israelites and their contract, but from the perspective of God and God's actions, it changes the story completely. Because even among these, when you look at this story from God's perspective, even after God determined judgment against the 7 nations, mercy was still available to them. God was still looking for a reason to forgive and to show mercy to them. You don't believe me? This is in Jeremiah chapter 18. Let's read this verse again. You've probably read it before. Do you think it applies to the nations of Canaan? Do you think it applies to the 7 nations that God had already passed a decree that they were to be destroyed? Jeremiah 18 and verse 7 and 8 says, "The instant I speak concerning a nation and concerning a kingdom to pluck up, to pull down, and to destroy it, if that nation against whom I have spoken turns from its evil, I will relent of the disaster that I thought to bring upon it." So even after God has spoken a divine decree against a nation because of their evil and said, this nation must be destroyed, even after that declaration has been made by God, if the nation turns from its evil and repents, what does God do? Does God go through with the judgment, or does he relent? Can you think of any stories in the Bible where that happened? Nineveh, the divine decree had already been passed. Jonah had been preaching, God has prophesied that your destruction is certain in 40 days. But the king of Nineveh turned in sackcloth and ashes towards God and the people, and God withdrew his judgments. And Nineveh was spared, and Nineveh was saved, and the destruction that had been determined against Nineveh never happened. So, do you think that would be true of the 7 nations? After God had said these 7 nations absolutely must be destroyed entirely, was God willing to pull that judgment back and spare and show mercy if they would turn around? He was, even after it had been declared in the book of Deuteronomy and the books of Moses. And so God is looking for an opening to show his mercy. So if the Gibeonites had come and asked and been truthful and pled for mercy, what do you believe? Do you believe God would have showed mercy to them? He would have. But these Gibeonites had a backwards way of pleading for mercy. They do it with a lie, they do it with deception and trickery. Does it not amaze you that even when we come to God with all of our baggage, with our lies and our trickery and all of our stuff, that God is still willing to accept us? And he looks through their lies and he sees through the Gibeonites that through it all this dishonesty, that still they were looking for his mercy. And God says, I'll take it. Liars, fraudsters, I'll spare them anyways, because behind it, underneath it, they are still looking for my mercy. And I will show it to them. A lot of times we come to God in the wrong way. And no doubt the way that they came to God was formed by their pagan view of their gods. It's disturbing to study the history of pagan gods and the darkness and the revenge and the fear. And they came to God with all of that. They no doubt saw the God of heaven in similar terms. And even then, God found a way that these people would be brought into the community of faith. But there was a consequence for their lie that they told. Let's go back to Joshua chapter 9. And Joshua in verse 22, Joshua called for them and he spoke to them, "Why have you deceived us?" They were wrong in doing that. It was a sin to tell a lie and deceive the people of God. You've deceived us, saying, "We are very far from you, when you dwell near us. Now therefore you are cursed, and none of you shall be freed from being slaves, woodcutters and water carriers for the house of my God." So there was a curse upon these Gibeonites, and there were consequences for them coming and deceiving the people of God. But am I the only one who in that curse that God passed, do you not see a blessing in that curse? These people, can you believe it, are brought into the center of Israelite community and brought into the service of the sanctuary. Not the priests that served in the holy place, but they were woodcutters and they were water carriers for the sanctuary. With sanctuary responsibilities, you know that they gave up their idols and they became an integral part of the Israelite system of worship. These people who were part of the 7 nations. The later history of the Gibeonites shows that the privileges they gained and the loyalty they maintained toward Israel. You can find this, you can look in Nehemiah. We find the Gibeonites again in Nehemiah. And you can look up the Bible commentators, and all of them acknowledge the lineage of these people here in Nehemiah. And here in Nehemiah, Israel has been taken centuries later, they've been taken as captives along with Israel to Babylon, because Babylon had conquered Israel. And the Gibeonites had been taken to Babylon as well. And they could have continued enjoying the luxuries of Babylon, but they chose willfully to return to Jerusalem with the people of God. Look at where they're named in Nehemiah chapter 3 and verse 7. Nehemiah chapter 3 and verse 7. So it's mentioning those that have come to rebuild the wall. And next to them was Melatiah, the Gibeonite, Jadon, the Meronothite, the men of Gibeon and Mizpah, repaired the residence of the governor of the region beyond the river. And it wasn't just 2 or 3 of them. They're mentioned again in chapter 7, verse 25. And this is the scroll. This is the accounting or the record, the names of all those that returned, the captives that returned to Jerusalem. And Nehemiah 7:25, the sons of Gibeon. How many? 95. They could have stayed in Babylon, but these people who had come to God with a fraud, with a deception, and pled for the mercy of God, they took their consequences, which was both a curse and a blessing, because they were servants but they were also in connection with the sanctuary, which was a blessing. And they said, by moving back with Nehemiah to Jerusalem, they declared their lasting faith in the God of Israel and in the destiny of Jerusalem. So apparently the Gibeonites agreed with the psalmist in Psalm 84, verse 10, when he says, "A day in your courts is better than 1,000. I would rather be a doorkeeper in the house of my God than dwell in the tents of wickedness." They said, yeah, we may just be slaves, we may be woodcutters, carry water, doorkeeper, you can give me any of it. It's better to be in the house of God than to dwell in the tents of wickedness. And these Gibeonites received the blessings of Israel just like all the others of Israel. And so, yes, we may be slaves in the sanctuary, but that's okay because we've been redeemed and God saved them. Well, what do you think for us today? 7 nations were under a divine decree of judgment, under the death sentence, every one of them. God found an opening to save these Gibeonites. Are we under a death decree? We are. Romans 6:23. All have sinned, fallen short of the glory of God, and the wages of sin is death. Are we more entitled to the blessings of God and his people than the Gibeonites? We don't deserve anything more than what they deserved. It's only by the grace of God, and it's only by his mercy that any of us find a place of belonging among the people of God and receive his promises and his covenants. And finally, in Joshua chapter 10, that's a famous story, right? That's the one where they go up to battle. They hear that all of their neighbors of the Gibeonites had turned on them because of their league with Israel. Joshua marched all night with the fighting men of Israel. And they went up against them in battle in Joshua chapter 10. And this is the story where the sun stands still for a day. And it was not only to protect Israel, but it was to protect Gibeon, one of the 7 nations. So when it says in Joshua 10, in verse 14, the Lord fought for Israel. In all these battles, none of it would have happened if it was just a normal war. No, it wasn't a normal war in Joshua. It was judgment from God. It was a divine decree. And God fought for Israel. But he also fought for Gibeon. Those that were to be destroyed are now those that are to be saved. And so, since we have no credentials ourselves, perhaps like Rahab, and perhaps like the Gibeonites, perhaps we should also throw ourselves on the mercies of God. What do you think? And at the end of 2024, maybe this is a good time to review our lives, to review our priorities, to realize we have nothing to bring or to save ourselves. We're no better than anybody else that's gone before us, and to lean completely on the mercy of God to save us. As we look at 2025, to put our priorities straight, because there's a lot of noise in this world to distract us in different directions. But God wants to save each one of us, and he wants to do something very special with each one of us this next year.